The West had never been merciful. It was a place where justice bent beneath the weight of fear, where a widow could be condemned for nothing more than surviving. Yet on that morning, as the rope swung, a rider approached. The dawn crept gray and brittle over the town of Ash Hollow. The sky hung low, a veil of thin cloud that swallowed the stars and made the earth look bleached and tired. Wind hissed across the hard-packed dirt of the main street, lifting dust that clung to wooden steps and the tired faces of those already awake. At the center of town, near the well and the sagging church, stood the gallows, half-built, its beams darkened with tar. It rose like a skeleton, promise enough of what was to come. The rope hung idle, though its shadow lay long across the ground, a reminder that death was being measured plank by plank. Men worked on it slow, as if the weight of what they were making pressed heavy on their arms. Women hurried their children past, whispering the name of the condemned as if it might stain their tongues. Clara Hayes sat in the jail, her back pressed against stone cold as a grave. Her dress, once blue, though faded near to gray, was torn at the hem. Bruises painted her wrists, reminders of rough hands pulling her in from the night she had been caught. She did not cry. The tears had dried long before the cell door closed. Instead, she sat with her palms folded in her lap, staring at the small window where the dawn seeped in, pale and watchful. The town called her widow, thief, liar. They said she had sold off another man's cattle for her own gain. Some whispered she had planned the robbery with outlaws who fled, leaving her behind. Clara said little in her defense. She was not innocent, not entirely, but nor was she guilty enough to deserve the noose. Yet in Ash Hollow, justice came not by weight of truth, but by measure of who stood behind you. Clara had no one. She thought of her husband, buried these 3 winters. He had left her land but little kindness. His rocking chair still creaked in her mind, a shape before a fire gone cold. His death had not been the end of her loneliness, only its sharpening. The sheriff had told her plain. At dawn, when the gallows were finished, she would stand trial. And trials in Ash Hollow were swift things. That morning, before the gallows took their final shape, a rider came. He appeared on the horizon like a shadow split from the storm clouds. His horse was a dark bay, restless under the weight of dust and miles. The rider sat straight, shoulders broad beneath a long coat faded by sun and weather. A rifle was slung across his saddle, and at his side hung a revolver worn smooth at the grip. His hat brim was pulled low, and though no one could yet see his eyes, they felt them all the same, cold, heavy, measuring. When he reached the edge of town, folks stepped back from their porches, whispering in tones half fearful, half awed. Children were pulled indoors, doors shut soft as breath. The blacksmith muttered a name, then spat as if to rid himself of it. The saloon girl leaned in the doorway and crossed herself. Jonah Vane. Some said he had killed 20 men, others said 50. All agreed he had outlived more bullets than was natural. A man of silence, a man of storms. The kind who carried death on his boots like dust. He rode his horse straight down the center of Ash Hollow. Hooves struck hollow on the packed dirt, echoing off the false-fronted buildings. He did not look right or left. Only when he reached the sheriff's office did he dismount, boots crunching against the grit, long coat shifting with the wind. Sheriff Mallory stepped out to meet him, hand resting on the butt of his pistol, though his face betrayed unease. "Morning, Vane," he said, voice dry. "Can't say I expected you here." Jonah's eyes, when he lifted his hat brim, were dark as storm glass. "The woman," he said simply. Clara Hayes, the sheriff stiffened. Around them, townsfolk gathered in cautious silence, peering from behind posts and windows. Jonah's voice carried with the weight of a man unaccustomed to questions. "She's to hang at dawn," Mallory replied, more firmly now. Justice must be done. Jonah's gaze shifted toward the half-built gallows. He studied it as if it were a thing alive, as if he had seen too many just like it and none had ended well. His jaw tightened, scar along his cheekbones stark in the gray light. He turned back to the sheriff. "I'll see her." It was not a request. Inside the jail, Clara lifted her head at the sound of boots crossing the floorboards. The door opened and the gunslinger filled the frame. For a moment she thought him death itself, come early and cloaked in dust. His face was carved by weather and time, his eyes carrying something colder than anger and deeper than grief. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice low, rough from silence. Jonah did not answer. He studied her the way a man studies land before planting, measuring its barrenness, its worth, its scars. Then, without a word, He turned back toward the sheriff's desk. "She'll not hang," he said. "Not tomorrow. Not any day." Gasps rustled through the bystanders at the door. The sheriff's hand twitched toward his pistol but stilled, as though he weighed what it would mean to cross Jonah Vane. "And why's that?" Mallory asked carefully. Jonah's gaze did not waver. "Because she's mine." The words hung heavy in the air, heavier than the unfinished gallows outside. Clara's breath caught. She felt a shiver, anger, fear, something she could not name, ripple through her chest. She wanted to protest, to deny this claim, but the strength left her tongue. She had been abandoned so long, left with nothing but the cold press of stone and the whispers of her own worthlessness. Now this man, whose name carried dread and silence, declared her life bound to his. It was not kindness, not salvation. It was something harder, sharper, a reprieve bound in chains she could not yet see. And yet, for the first time since the cell door closed, she felt the faintest warmth of reprieve flicker against the cold. The cell smelled of iron, dust, and damp straw. Clara sat with her knees drawn close, listening to the murmur of voices outside. The town had grown restless since Jonah Vane's words hung in the air like thunder. "She's mine," a claim that had silenced the sheriff and unsettled every soul within earshot. Clara pressed her fingers against the stone wall, cool and rough beneath her palm. It anchored her in the present, yet her thoughts kept drifting backward, pulled into the hollow places where memory gnawed. She thought of her husband, Daniel Hayes, a farmer who'd worn his hat low against the sun and his temper lower still. His hands had been hard as the plow he gripped, his words harder. She remembered nights of silence where the fire crackled louder than his voice, and mornings when his absence in the fields was a relief. When he died in a border raid, an arrow piercing his chest before the cattle he had tried to defend, she had wept because death was final, not because she could not imagine life without him. Yet widowhood had not freed her. It had branded her. Alone she was prey for gossip, for debt, for every wandering man's suspicion. The land withered under her care, and hunger took root where love had never grown. Her loneliness was sharper than barbed wire. It cut her whenever she thought she might lean on someone again. From her window, Clara saw Jonah Vane standing in the street. He leaned against the rail outside the sheriff's office, hat brim shadowing his face. His coat stirred in the wind, revealing the revolver at his hip, its grip worn smooth, as though his palm had rested there more often than on the hand of any friend. The scar that crossed his jaw glinted pale beneath the morning light. She wondered who had given it to him, and how many had fallen for every mark left upon his skin. He looked at the gallows often, not with fear but with the cold recognition of a man staring at an old enemy. She realized then that he had lost someone to the rope. Perhaps a brother, perhaps more. The thought unsettled her, for it hinted at grief deep enough to drive a man into the wilderness and keep him there. Jonah carried silence like a weapon. Where others filled space with words, he stood apart, watching. Men muttered about him in the saloon, their voices brittle. No one challenged him openly. The sheriff, though outwardly bristling, had not yet tested Jonah's resolve. That evening, the sun bled red into the horizon, staining the half-built gallows with color like rust. Clara heard the sheriff and Jonah speaking just beyond the bars of her cell. She pressed close, breath caught, listening. "You can't come into Ash Hollow and dictate law," Sheriff Mallory said, his voice hard but edged with unease. "I'm not dictating," Jonah replied, calm, low, steady. "I'm offering." "What offer?" Jonah's boots scraped against the floorboards as he shifted. "You want her punished. The town wants her gone. I'll take her. As wife." The sheriff swore under his breath. "That's no justice. That's barter." "It's the law," Jonah said. "Marriage binds her to me. No gallows can touch her once she's claimed." "You know it." Silence stretched. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs. She gripped the bars, the chill biting into her hands. "And if she refuses?" Mallory asked. Jonah's reply came slow, deliberate. "She won't hang. One way or the other." The words filled Clara with both fury and a strange, desperate relief. To be handed from the noose to a stranger, what kind of salvation was that? Yet the rope was certain death. And Jonah's claim, for all its iron edges, carried a sliver of life. The sheriff spat, then muttered, "You always did bend law to your liking, Vane. But the town won't stomach it." Jonah said nothing more. His silence closed the conversation as firmly as any slammed door. When the men left, Clara sank to the cot in her cell. The dusk pressed close, and with it came the ghosts of memory. She dreamed of her husband's rocking chair by the fire, empty now, yet not free. She wondered if ghosts clung to places, to vows, to the skin of those left behind. If Daniel still lingered in that chair, would he rage to see another man claim her, even if that man's claim meant her survival? Could the dead forgive the living for choosing life? Her thoughts spiraled with the crackle of the unseen fire, the groan of the chair, the weight of silence between one man gone and another man waiting. Outside, Jonah stood under the awning, rain beginning to fall in slow, heavy drops. The storm darkened the sky, and the gallows shone slick beneath it, beams gleaming like bones. He touched the scar at his jaw absently, as if it burned. His revolver rested at his side, his hand near but not upon it. The townsfolk watched from behind shutters, murmuring that the gunslinger had come not for death this time, but for a bride. Clara lay awake long into the night, staring at the cracks in the stone ceiling, the sound of the rain sinking into her bones. She did not know if she was being saved or sentenced to a different kind of prison. Yet beneath her anger, beneath the fear, a fragile thread of hope wound through the darkness. It was the cruelest kind of hope, the kind that asked her to trust a man she did not understand, a man who carried death in silence and shadows. And yet, when she closed her eyes, it was not the gallows she saw, but the way Jonah had looked at them, as if he too despised the rope. Perhaps they were both bound by ghosts. The day broke heavy with silence after Jonah's bargain with the sheriff. By midday, Clara was led from her cell, her wrists still marked by iron, though the shackles had been removed. The townsfolk lined the street, their eyes sharp, their whispers sharper. Some spat in the dust as she passed. Others crossed themselves, muttering of shame and salvation bound together in a gunslinger's claim. Jonah walked at her side, his stride steady, unhurried. He neither acknowledged the crowd nor their murmurs. The weight of his presence parted them as surely as a river splits stone. His horse waited at the edge of town, rein swaying in the wind. Without ceremony, he helped Clara mount, then swung into his own saddle. No one tried to stop him. Not the sheriff, not the men who had nailed the gallows into the earth. Only silence followed as horse and rider carried the widow away, shadowed by the man who had claimed her. The prairie stretched vast and merciless beyond Ash Hollow. Grass bent low against the rising wind. Clouds gathered thick upon the horizon, gray turning black, a wall of storm waiting. The air held the metallic taste of rain not yet fallen. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her braid unraveling in the gusts. Jonah rode ahead, silent, a dark figure cut against darker skies. By the time the storm broke, they had reached a scatter of cottonwoods and the broken spine of an old trail. Rain fell sudden and hard, pelting like thrown stones. Wind howled through the branches, rattling them like bones. Lightning split the sky, searing white against the endless gray. Jonah steered them toward a structure crouched low in the distance, an abandoned homestead, its roof sagging, its walls scarred by time. The door hung crooked, but it stood against the storm, and that was enough. They dismounted quickly, leading the horses inside what remained of a lean-to. Then Jonah guided Clara through the warped doorway into the house. Inside, shadows pressed thick. Dust lay over the floor, disturbed by their steps. The timbers groaned as the storm slammed against them, but they held. Jonah struck flint to tinder, coaxing a flame in the hearth. Soon firelight flickered, pushing the darkness into corners. The glow carved the hollows of his face into sharp relief. High cheekbones, jaw scarred and unyielding, eyes black as unspilled ink. Clara sank onto a wooden bench, her shawl soaked, her dress clinging to her. The fire's heat stung against her chilled skin. She glanced at Jonah as he drew a knife from his belt and began to sharpen it with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of stone against steel cut through the storm's roar, steady, unrelenting. "Do you ever speak?" she asked at last, her voice hoarse, half challenging. Jonah did not look up. "When there's need. And now? When you've dragged me from the rope and set me in a stranger's house, there's no need?" The knife paused, caught in the firelight. His gaze lifted, meeting hers across the flicker of flame. For a heartbeat, she thought he might answer something true, something raw, but he only said, "Storm will pass." Clara turned her face away, stung by the quiet dismissal. Yet even in her frustration, she felt the strange comfort of his silence. He was not a man of lies. His few words held weight, and the space between them carried a shield as sure as any wall. The night deepened. Rain battered the roof until it seemed the boards would split. Wind screamed through the cracks, cold enough to seep into bone. Clara, weary from the ride, found her hands restless. She gathered her damp hair and began to weave it into a braid. Her fingers moved with instinct, binding loose strands into order. It was a small act, but to her it felt like resistance against the chaos outside. Jonah's eyes lingered on her as she worked. The braid, thick and dark, fell over her shoulder like a cord of rope. In the fire's glow, it shone with the sheen of water and midnight. Something stirred in his expression, fleeting and unreadable. He remembered his mother's hands long ago, braiding her hair by lamplight in a cabin not so different from this one. He had been a boy then, too young to carry a gun, too young to know what choices would strip the farm from him and leave him to the open road. His mother's braids had been a symbol of care, of order, of survival against the winds that battered their walls. Watching Clara now, he felt the faint ghost of that memory press against the scar tissue of his life. Clara finished the braid and tied it with a strip torn from her dress. She caught Jonah watching. For a moment, neither looked away. The storm hammered overhead, wild and unrelenting, yet the silence between them was heavier still. "You think I should thank you," she said finally. Her voice was low but steady. Jonah's expression did not change. "No, then why?" His hand closed around the knife. He set it aside, the blade gleaming in the firelight. His answer came after a long pause, weighted with something she could not yet name. "Because I know the rope." The words struck her like cold water. They carried grief, not boasting, and in that moment Clara realized his scar, his silence, his storm-dark eyes. All of it spoke of a man bound by ghosts as much as she was. The fire crackled, casting shadows that swayed like spirits across the walls. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter, her braid warm against her neck. She did not thank him nor curse him. She only sat in silence, knowing the storm outside would pass, but the storms within them both had only begun to break. The storm did not break in a single night. It lingered, gray and sodden, stretching across the horizon for days. Rain softened the ground into mud, the sky sagged low and heavy, and the homestead seemed to shrink beneath the weight of it. Inside, Clara and Jonah settled into a rhythm that was neither peace nor war, but something in between. Jonah rose with the dim light, stoked the fire back to life, and set a tin pot of coffee to boil. The smell was strong, bitter, black as iron, and it filled the room with a rough kind of comfort. Clara, unused to such company, found herself watching him in the small acts. The way he measured grounds by sight, the patience with which he waited for the brew to settle, the slow pour into battered tin cups. She sewed while he worked, her fingers clumsy with needle and thread. A torn sleeve of his coat lay in her lap, the fabric thick and unyielding. She pricked her finger more than once, swallowing curses under her breath. Jonah glanced at her once, saw the smear of blood on her fingertip, and said nothing. His silence was not judgment, but it pressed against her nerves all the same. Meals were plain. Hardtack softened in broth, strips of dried meat, the last of the flour baked into flat rounds. They ate without words, the scrape of tin forks against plates louder than their breathing. At times the silence between them felt sharp, like the edge of his knife on stone. At other times it settled almost tender, as though words might bruise something fragile if spoken too carelessly. On the third evening, Clara broke it. "Why did you come?" she asked, her voice low but steady. She sat near the hearth, her braid loose now, strands falling against her cheek. Shadows from the fire danced across the walls. Jonah sat across from her, his back to the window where rain streaked the glass. He was whittling a piece of wood into nothing in particular, his hands steady, his eyes lowered. At her question, he paused, the knife held still in his palm. He did not answer. Clara pressed on. "You say you know the rope. That's reason enough to hate it. But why me? You could have ridden past. You could have let them build their gallows." Jonah's jaw tightened. He shaved another curl from the wood, letting it fall to the floor. His silence grew heavier, and Clara felt heat rise in her chest. "You think saving me makes me yours," she said, bitterness sharp in her tone. "I was condemned, not claimed. There's a difference." His eyes lifted then, storm-dark, steady on hers. The fire crackled between them. "I don't mistake the difference," he said quietly. For a moment Clara thought she had broken through, but his gaze dropped again and the wall of silence rose back up, thicker than before. She turned away, angered by his refusal to speak, yet haunted by the weight of the words he had chosen. That night she dreamed of rope and rocking chairs. of her husband's ghost staring from the fire while Jonah stood in shadow, knife glinting in hand. She woke with sweat on her neck and the storm still clawing at the roof. The following afternoon, hoofbeats sounded in the distance. Clara stiffened, her heart thudding. Jonah had heard them first. He was already at the doorway. Rifle in hand, his body taut with watchfulness. Through the rain, figures appeared. 3 riders on ponies, their silhouettes blurred by the downpour. They moved with ease, their long hair tied back, their faces painted in streaks of ochre and ash. Clara's breath caught. Indians, she whispered, her voice sharp with fear. Jonah did not turn. Don't fear what you don't know. The riders circled, not close enough to threaten, not far enough to ignore. After a tense minute, one of them nudged his pony forward, a young man with braids dark against his chest. He raised his hand in greeting, palm open, and called out in a tongue Clara did not understand. Jonah lowered his rifle but did not set it aside. He stepped out beneath the awning, rain slanting across his shoulders. He answered, not in English but in words rough, halting yet clear enough to be understood. Clara blinked, startled. She had not expected Jonah to know their speech. The young rider slid from his horse, a small bundle of pelts in his arms. He approached with caution, though his eyes never wavered. Jonah met him halfway. They spoke briefly, words exchanged with respect, their tones even. When Jonah returned, he carried a cured hide and a pouch of dried berries. For trade, he said simply, setting them on the table. Clara stared at the gifts, then at him. You trusted him. Jonah shrugged out of his wet coat, hanging it by the fire. Respect's not trust, but it keeps a man alive longer than fear does. His words lingered in the room. Clara thought of Ash Hollow, of the way fear had ruled the sheriff, the townsfolk, even her own husband when raiders came. Jonah's code, she realized, was not just the quick draw of his gun. It was balance. It was seeing men as men, even when others called them enemy. That night, while Jonah sharpened his knife in his usual, patient rhythm, Clara sat with her hands in her lap, studying him through the wavering firelight. She still feared him, his silence, his scar, the shadows that clung to him. But beneath that fear, something else stirred. Not trust, not yet, but a seed of respect. She saw then that he was not merely her captor, not only the man who had pulled her from the noose. He was marked by loss, carved by it as surely as scars marked his skin, and though he would not speak it, she sensed he carried grief for someone who had faced the rope without reprieve. Her heart, hardened by loneliness, shifted ever so slightly. Not softened, not yet, but no longer frozen. The storm eased the next morning. Pale light filtered through the cracks in the shutters. The rain finally spent. Clara braided her hair with steady fingers. Jonah poured the coffee, black and bitter. Neither spoke. Yet in the silence, something unspoken passed between them. Something that was not possession nor salvation, but the beginning of survival shared. Winter pressed itself hard against the boards of the cabin. Cold seeped through the cracks like a thief, stealing warmth from the air, numbing fingers and breath. Snow lay thick across the plains, whitening the land until horizon and sky blurred into one endless pale silence. Inside, the hearth glowed, the fire stubborn in its fight against the season. Its light flickered across the room, touching Clara's shawl, Jonah's coat, the tools spread out upon the table. Jonah worked with steady hands, mending a broken hinge, sharpening blades dulled by time. The rhythm of his movements was patient, practiced, each scrape and turn deliberate. Clara watched him while she stitched a tear in her skirt, her needle flashing in and out of the fabric. Her fingers had grown steadier in recent days, less clumsy than before. She told herself it was necessity, not habit, that taught her patience. Their exchanges grew softer as winter deepened. Jonah poured her coffee without asking. Clara saved the better cut of meat for his plate. They did not name these gestures nor spoke of them, but each left its mark. One night, with snow rattling against the shutters, Clara sat close to the fire, her hands folded in her lap. Her braid lay heavy across her shoulder, glinting in the glow. She stared at the flames until her vision blurred, then spoke words she had long buried. My husband was not the man the town remembers. Jonah looked up from the whetstone he was using, his eyes steady on her face. He did not speak, only listened. He was cruel, she said, not in ways the law punishes, but in ways that rot the spirit. His words cut deeper than fists, though he knew both. He left me empty long before the raiders left me widowed. Her voice shook, but she pressed on. When he died, I thought myself cursed for mourning a man I was glad to lose. Widowhood freed me, yet chained me all the same. Every whisper, every judgment in town, it weighed heavier than the grave. The fire popped, scattering sparks up the chimney. Clara did not look at Jonah, afraid of pity in his eyes. But when she did lift her gaze, she found no pity there. Only presence, still unflinching, as though he bore her words without seeking to ease them. His silence was a gift, a space where her confession could exist without shame. She exhaled, and for the first time in years, the weight eased from her chest. Jonah returned to his blade, slow and deliberate, but Clara knew something had shifted. The days passed quietly until danger broke their fragile peace. It came with hoofbeats muffled by snow, with shadows moving against the pale horizon. Outlaws, 3 of them, their faces hidden by scarves, rifles slung across their backs. They came not for Clara, but for Jonah. His name carried weight enough to draw men eager to test their luck against his legend. Jonah had seen them coming. He rose from his chair, rifle in hand, eyes narrowing. "Stay inside," he told Clara. But she followed to the door, heart hammering. Snow fell thick, whitening the world until the men seemed ghosts approaching through the haze. One shouted a curse, daring Jonah to step out and prove his hand was not too slow with age. Jonah stepped into the snow, his breath steaming in the cold. He moved with the same quiet certainty he had carried into Ash Hollow, steady, unhurried, as though the storm itself waited on his command. The first shot cracked the silence, echoing off the plains. Jonah's rifle answered sharp and sure. One outlaw fell, the snow stained dark around him, but the others pressed harder, circling. Gunfire burst, flashes of light in the white blur. Clara crouched behind the doorframe, trembling. Her hands clutched the wood, her breath ragged. She watched Jonah fire again, striking true, but another shot whistled past him, close enough to split his coat sleeve. Blood marked the fabric, her fear sharpened into resolve. She saw the rifle leaning by the hearth, Jonah's spare weapon. Before she could think herself out of it, Clara seized it. The weight of the gun staggered her, but she braced against the doorframe, her cheek pressed to the stock. Through the snowfall, she saw one of the outlaws raise his weapon, aiming for Jonah's unguarded side. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The blast cracked the air, louder than her heartbeat. The outlaw jerked, staggered, fell into the snow. Silence followed, broken only by the wind. The last rider, seeing his men down, turned his horse and fled into the storm, his curses carried away on the gale. Jonah lowered his rifle, his breath harsh in the cold. Slowly, he turned to Clara. She stood in the doorway, the rifle trembling in her grip, smoke still curling from its barrel. Her braid clung damp to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and fear. For a long moment, neither spoke. The snow fell between them, soft as ash. Jonah crossed the distance, his boots crunching in the drifts. He took the rifle gently from her shaking hand, set it aside, and then placed his hand over hers. His palm was rough, scarred, warm against her cold skin. No vows passed between them, no words claimed or bound. Yet in that quiet touch, stronger than law or rope, a bond was forged. Not of debt, not of survival alone, but of choice. Clara met his gaze, her breath still unsteady. In the firelight that spilled from the cabin, his eyes seemed less storm-dark, more steady earth. She felt her fear ease, not vanish but soften into something fiercer, something new. Jonah did not smile, nor did she. But when he let his hand linger on hers, she knew they had crossed a line the noose could never touch. The fire between them had begun, not in passion, but in the act of saving and being saved. And in its warmth, both found a piece of themselves they thought long buried. Spring loosened winter's grip with quiet persistence. Snow melted into rivulets that carved through the earth, feeding new grass that rose pale and green against the fading brown of the plains. The sky widened, blue as a fresh forged blade, and the air smelled of thawed soil and rain yet to come. Jonah and Clara rode side by side, their horses stepping sure upon the softened earth. She wore her shawl close against the morning chill, her braid brushing against it heavy down her back. He rode in his silence, hat pulled low, coat patched with her stitches, his revolver resting easy at his hip. They were returning to Ash Hollow. The town's shape grew out of the horizon. Low buildings clustered around the square, smoke lifting from chimneys, the gallows still standing though unused since the storm. Clara's chest tightened at the sight. Memories pressed in. The cell's damp chill, the jeers of townsfolk, the shadow of the rope that had waited for her. Yet the weight she carried now was different. No longer despair, but defiance. Jonah's presence beside her steadied her. His shadow fell across hers, not as captor nor savior, but as something stronger, quieter, an anchor. The sheriff was waiting. He stood in the square, hat pulled down, hands folded over his belt. Age had deepened the lines on his face, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, watchful, uneasy. Behind him, townsfolk gathered in wary silence. They had heard rumors of gunfire in the snow, of outlaws driven off, of a widow who rode now at the side of the feared Jonah Vane. Clara's heart pounded as they dismounted. The wood of the gallows loomed to her right, weathered now, streaked by rain. She met its gaze as if it were a beast once meant to devour her, and for the first time she did not flinch. "Sheriff," Jonah said, his voice flat but steady. The man studied him, then Clara. His jaw tightened. She was condemned. "You had no right." Jonah's eyes narrowed. "The rope has no right when guilt is twisted by spite. You know it, and the town knows it." A murmur passed through the crowd. Faces shifted, some ashamed, some hardened, others curious, even grudgingly respectful. Clara stepped forward, her shawl clutched in her hands. Her voice carried, not loud but unwavering. "I was no thief, no murderer. My only crime was having no man left to stand for me. You all knew it." Her eyes swept the square, meeting the gazes that once had looked at her with scorn. Now they faltered. "You built that gallows because it was easier than giving me dignity." The silence that followed was thick. The sheriff's mouth pressed into a hard line. His hand brushed his belt, not for his gun, but for steadiness. At last he exhaled, shoulders sagging under a weight too long carried. "Then dignity's yours now," he said. "You live. Not by the rope, not by my word, but by what you've proven." Clara let the words settle. They were no apology, no absolution, but they were enough. Jonah's gaze swept the crowd, daring any man to contradict. None did. The gallows loomed behind them, but its power had broken. The noose had lost its claim. They turned back to their horses. Jonah offered his hand to Clara as she mounted, not as an owner, but as a partner. She took it, her fingers steady in his grasp. The townsfolk watched in silence as they rode out, not fugitives, not condemned, but figures who carried something larger than law. Quiet defiance, earned freedom. A bond forged in storm and blood, not sanctioned by rope or scripture, yet truer than either. As the town dwindled behind them, Clara felt the weight on her shoulders ease. The gallows was behind her now, left to weather and rot. Ahead lay open land, green sprouting from thaw, the horizon unbroken. Her heart, once hardened by loneliness, beat steady with something new. She was no longer the widow who sat in a cell waiting for death. She had faced storm, fire, and blood. She had stood before a town that condemned her, and she had not bowed. Beside her rode Jonah Vane, once shadow, now anchor, now home. His silence spoke more than words, his presence a promise she need not question. She glanced at him, the scar on his jaw catching the sunlight, the hollows of his face softened by the spring air. He caught her gaze and held it. No smile passed his lips, yet something gentler flickered in his eyes. A recognition, a quiet surrender. Clara turned her face toward the horizon. The land stretched wide, alive with promise. She drew her shawl tighter, felt the braid heavy on her back, and rode on. The reckoning was behind them. The ride home had begun.